Notre Dame lost to Ohio State 34-23 in the national championship game, and it was honestly much worse than that at many points. It was 31-7 in favor of Ohio State at one point. That was, of course, at halftime. And this game to me really showed that there's levels to sports and there's levels to college football, and I just don't think Notre Dame was fully ready for this spotlight, partially because of injuries, partially because of just the setbacks from throughout the year. Across the board, Ohio State's roster was simply better than Notre Dame's. They spent millions on it with NIL collectives and things of that nature. Despite setbacks, Ohio State won it all. No matter what, whoever was going to win this game was going to have overcome either the loss to Northern Illinois or the loss to Michigan. Ohio State, with 2 losses, wins the national championship. They do it over Notre Dame in the final game last night. Will Howard went 17 for 21 for 231 yards and 2 touchdowns. Quinshon Judkins had 100 yards himself on the ground. Ohio State scored a touchdown on every first half drive. They scored a touchdown on their first 4 drives, and of course ends with a tally of 34 points. And that really leads into my first point. Now, when we previewed this game last week, we talked about a few things that I felt like Notre Dame could do to potentially lead them to victory. The number one thing there was keeping the scoring down. I called it accepting the gambit, right? If you look recently throughout the season, who were the teams that got the closest to beating Ohio State? Well, Oregon beat them, and they did let Ohio State score 31. That's an anomaly. Michigan kept that game at 13-10. Michigan ended up winning. Texas had a chance to win. They had the ball down 7 in or around the red zone, 21-14, right? So they keep Ohio State to 21, and of course Jack Sawyer has that return that makes it 28. But Ohio State, low-scoring game against Texas. That was their closest game of the playoff, and low-scoring game against Michigan. That was their major killer loss, or at least their only loss to a team that they were not able to avenge. And Notre Dame just couldn't contain the Buckeyes, right? Notre Dame zips down, scores 7-0, and really the question to me across the board was, you're looking at Riley Leonard and saying, how many more times are we going to ask him to do this? How many more times are we going to look at Riley Leonard and say, okay, you've got to march down the field that same way with that same amount of effectiveness again and again? If he only had to do it 3 or 4 times to win, maybe he does. But Ohio State ended with 34 points. That's effectively the equivalent of 5 touchdowns. You're asking Riley Leonard to go down the field and do that 4 to 6 times, right? Could be turnovers, anything like that. You're asking him to do it 4, 5, 6 times against this Ohio State defense, and that just wasn't going to be possible. Again, in part because of injuries, in part because of the gap in roster talent, right? Notre Dame just would not have been able to win a shootout, so they needed to keep the scoring down, and they just couldn't do that. And we saw that in the first half, and that, to me, immediately indicates that the game's over. I mean, it doesn't take anyone with any level of intelligence to know that 31-7 at halftime is probably indicative of the idea that the game is indeed over. But that fact alone, the fact that Notre Dame couldn't contain Ohio State, was enough to tell the world that Notre Dame was not going to be able to win a shootout, because if it was going to be a shootout, Notre Dame was always going to lose this game. The second point, though, and if Ohio State's offense was going to be churning and if it was going to be high octane, the second aspect of this is whether or not Notre Dame can just win the turnover battle and have a few chance plays and potentially put themselves in a position late in the fourth quarter to end up winning the game. And they kind of did that. It was just too little too late. What we wanted to see was mistakes out of Will Howard, because this is a real fascinating test for this Notre Dame defense, right? Because the secondary has been dominant all year long, and that defense really had been dominant all year long. And you look at this secondary for Notre Dame, who, again, they've been locking down quarterbacks, locking down receivers, taking away their options, forcing mistakes. The pass rush gets to the quarterback, and then they're going to have no one to throw to. And if you keep making that happen play after play after play, they're bound to throw a couple of interceptions. And that is half of what really led to Notre Dame being one of the best teams in the country in terms of taking the ball away and, of course, protecting it themselves. But they haven't yet played a quarterback to the level of Will Howard, right? Drew Aller was prone to making mistakes like the interception that he threw that effectively ended the game. But I talked about this in the preview. Will Howard was not going to do that. Will Howard was not going to hand the game away like Drew Aller would, like a backup quarterback at Georgia would, Curtis Rourke, and going back through Notre Dame's entire schedule. They were going to have to force mistakes out of the quarterback. That's how they got here, was forcing mistakes out of Drew Aller, right? Specifically, Drew Aller in the semifinal game. Tie ball game late in the fourth quarter, force a mistake, interception, so that you can kick the game-winning field goal instead of Penn State. They've been forcing mistakes out of quarterbacks, and that's been a major part of how they've been winning. They just hadn't, again, played a quarterback like Will Howard yet, and he ended up being too much for the Irish. Again, 17 for 21 for 231 yards and 2 touchdowns. Most importantly, 0 interceptions, 0 fumbles. Will Howard was perfect. Emeka Egbuka fumbled in the fourth quarter, and that set up Notre Dame's opportunity to potentially make a 2-score deficit, a 1-score deficit, and make some shenanigans happen from there. Obviously, they could not convert that into a victory, as you may expect. But again, Notre Dame was going to need to force turnovers to win because Ohio State is just the superior team, right? Ohio State has a superior roster, offense athletically much better than the defense, right? Especially with the injuries Notre Dame has seen. And because of that gap in talent, raw talent, and ability and skill, things of those nature, Notre Dame was going to have to turn the ball over, and that was going to have to come with Will Howard throwing interceptions, in my opinion, most specifically, and Notre Dame picking off some of those passes, and they just weren't able to do that. Howard was not picked off once. He made very great decisions. Possibly there's a 14-point swing of a play to keep Notre Dame in it when Emeka Egbuka fumbled, but again, Will Howard was triumphant. 17 for 21, 231 yards, 2 touchdowns. He did not make the mistakes that you would expect a quarterback maybe somewhere else on Notre Dame's schedule to make. And again, this Notre Dame defense could not force the mistakes out of Will Howard that they could for Drew Aller and other quarterbacks on the schedule. That was a major part of Notre Dame winning games, and unfortunately, it wasn't a factor for them winning this one because they didn't win, in part because they failed in this category. But maybe that's just totally fine, right? Maybe Ohio State has one turnover and it's just a stray play in the fourth quarter that more or less arguably is garbage time. Maybe the other quarterback on the other side can win the game for Notre Dame offensively, and that comes with Riley Leonard on the ground. Because, again, this defense is incredible, and we knew that about Notre Dame. But what we knew about the offense was Riley Leonard and his ability to pose 2 threats on the field, right? A dual-threat quarterback in Riley Leonard. He can throw and he can run. And Riley Leonard in this game was going to have to pose both threats. We saw that against Georgia most specifically, right? In that Georgia game, Riley Leonard, he could run and he could throw. He led the team in rushing on much fewer carries than this game against Georgia. Riley Leonard was fantastic on the ground against Georgia, and that's really a large part in how they were able to win that game, at least on the offensive side of the ball, was, again, Riley Leonard, naturally, as the quarterback, he's going to be a threat throwing the ball. If you're a defense, you have to keep that in mind. And if you kept that in mind a little bit too much, like Georgia sometimes did, Riley Leonard was going to make you punish you with the ground game. But Riley Leonard in this game had 17 carries for only 2.4 yards per carry. He was largely on pace with Howard through the air, although it took many more attempts to catch up to his effectiveness. And he really couldn't establish a true dual threat presence across the board, right? Riley Leonard, more or less, him not being effective on the ground really took away a lot of the threat that this offense has posed against teams throughout their regular season schedule and teams, of course, in the playoff. So Notre Dame, with Riley Leonard not able to really be effective on the ground, that effectively told Ohio State that them just throwing the ball is all that they really need to worry about. And of course, props to the run defense for containing Riley Leonard. But that really took a lot of pressure off the defense, and therefore it was much more difficult for Notre Dame to move the ball down the field and score. Aside from, of course, that first drive where Riley Leonard really excelled on the ground and really excelled on offense in general. So again, looking back across the entire game, right away, number one point is Ohio State was scoring. And because Ohio State was scoring drive after drive and touchdowns drive after drive, we knew Notre Dame wasn't going to be able to keep up with that. They had to keep the scoring down. They had to make it a defensive game the way Texas did, the way Michigan did. One of those teams was successful. Maybe Notre Dame could be successful too. But again, Ohio State just broke the doors wide open and were touchdown. And there was just nothing, at least it felt like, there was just nothing that Notre Dame was necessarily going to be able to do about that. On the other side of the ball, they couldn't force mistakes out of Will Howard, right? He's just a better quarterback than they faced all year long. We didn't quite know if he was going to be too much for Notre Dame. It turns out that he was. He didn't make the mistakes that maybe were necessary for Notre Dame to turn the ball over a couple more times and win the game. And then Riley Leonard on the ground on offense, right? If Notre Dame was ever going to catch up, they were going to need a dual threat presence from their quarterback. And unfortunately, this Ohio State defense just thwarted Riley Leonard's run presence. And that, again, is part of why Notre Dame was unable to come away with this win in this game. Across the board, phenomenal game, phenomenal moment for Notre Dame, right? Roller coaster of emotions for Ohio State. They lose to Michigan, and then they just start their death march to glory where they decimate Tennessee, they decimate Oregon, and they find their way here in the national championship game against Notre Dame, and they win. So weird season for Ohio State. They won the national championship, but they didn't do everything that they maybe set out to do. And of course, the Michigan loss is what I'm speaking on there. On the other side, we know that there's going to be a bright future ahead for Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame. They've reached the title game and really a new era for the Fighting Irish, right? Marcus Freeman has fully set in there. They've made the playoff. They've made a playoff run. They've made the national championship game. Even with a loss to Northern Illinois, Notre Dame did almost everything that they would have appreciated doing right at the end of the season, besides, of course, win the big one. But the 12-team playoff era is here, and as long as the rules stay as they are, Notre Dame is going to be in perfect position to have home playoff games every single year and have more opportunities every single year to put together playoff runs like this one, and maybe eventually Marcus Freeman, as he gains some more resources. It's the era of the NIL and the transfer portal. Maybe Marcus Freeman with more resources and a better draw in the national championship, perhaps, more chaos around him. Marcus Freeman can set himself up for an opportunity to take Notre Dame to the promised land once again. Time will tell on Notre Dame and whether or not they can actually get over the hump and win it all. But again, they weren't ready, right? Ohio State had the superior roster. Ohio State was the superior team, superior program. Notre Dame is working up to that point still. Ohio State, it's taken them some time to work themselves up to this point, right? Obviously, they've been there. They're a blue blood program. They've been here forever. But they've lost to Michigan 4 times in a row, right? Ohio State, it's taken them a minute to work themselves back up to this level where they could actually get over the hump and win it. They were a field goal away from doing it a few years ago. They lost in the semifinals to Georgia. And now they finally get over the hump. They beat Notre Dame. They win the national championship. Notre Dame, they'll get there. They're not there yet. And we just outlined the reasons why there was the gap, right? The reasons why Ohio State primarily was able to beat Notre Dame. Notre Dame will get there. A bright future is ahead for Marcus Freeman, and I'm very excited to watch it all play out.